Assalamualaikum and good morning to each and everyone. I am Siti Fairozi Barut and I am going to report the object relations theory by Melanie versus Klein. So I'm going to start first with a brief introduction about the life of Melanie Klein. So, who is Melanie Klein? Born on the 30th of March 1882 in Vienna, Austria-Hungary, from a non-religious family of Jewish ancestry. She is the fourth and final child of Dr. Maurice Rhizes and Libusa Rhizes. Klein believed her birth to be unplanned, and saw herself as rejected by both parents. At age 21, she married an industrial chemist, Arthur Klein. Soon after gave birth to their first child, Melita, then followed by her son Hans in 1907, and her second son Eric was born in 1914. Klein suffered from clinical depression with her pregnancies taking quite a toll on her. With this and her unhappy marriage soon led Klein to seek treatment. In 1910, Klein began a course of therapy with psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi. Her separation from her husband, that eventually led to divorce, leads to strained relationship both personally and professionally with her daughter Milita. So let's start. What is the object relations theory? Object relations theory of Melanie Klein was built on careful observation of young children. In contrast to Freud, who emphasized the first 4 to 6 years of life, Klein stressed the importance of the first 4 to 6 months after birth. She insisted that the infant's drives, such as hunger, sex, and so forth, are directed to an object, a breast, a penis, a vagina, and so on. According to Klein, the child's relation to the breast is fundamental and serves as a prototype for later relations to home objects such as mother, father, and other individuals. So let's move on to the psychic life of infants. Whereas Freud emphasized the first few years of life, Klein stressed the importance of the first 4 or 6 months. To her, infants do not begin life with a blank slate, but with an inherited predisposition to reduce the anxiety they experience as a result of the conflict produced by the forces of the life instinct and the power of the death instinct. So the next one is the fantasies. Fantasies. One of Klein's basic assumptions is that the infant, even at birth, possesses an active fantasy life. These fantasies are psychic representations of unconscious id instincts, and it should not be confused with the conscious fantasies of older children and adults. In fact, Klein intentionally spelled fantasy this way to make it distinguishable. When Klein wrote of the dynamic fantasy life of infants, she did not suggest that newborn babies could put thoughts into words. She simply meant that they possess unconscious images of good and bad. For example, a full stomach is good, an empty one is bad. Those Klein would say that infants who fall asleep while sucking on their fingers are fantasizing about having their mother's good breast inside themselves. Similarly, hungry infants who cry and kick their legs are fantasizing that they are destroying the bad breath. So let's move on with the objects. Klein agreed with Freud that humans have innate drives or instincts, including a death instinct. Drives, of course, must have some objects, include any person or thing through which a drive is satisfied. Thus, the hunger has the good breast as its object, while the sex drive has a sexual organ as its object, and so on. Klein believed that from early infancy, children relate to these external objects both in fantasy and in reality. So let's move on to different positions. Klein saw human infants as constantly engaging in a basic conflict between the life instinct and the death instinct, that is, between good and bad, love and hate, creativity and destruction. In their attempt to deal with this dichotomy of good and bad feelings, infants organize their experiences into positions or ways of dealing with both internal and external objects. Klein chose the term position rather than stage of development to indicate that positions alternate back and forth. So there are two types of positions. These are the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. So let's start first with the paranoid schizoid position. Klein called the paranoid schizoid position a way of organizing experiences that includes both paranoid feelings of being persecuted and a splitting of internal and external objects into the good and the bad. According to Klein, infants develop the paranoid schizoid position during their first 3 or 4 months of life, during which time the ego's perception of the external world is subjective and fantastic rather than objective and real. Thus, the persecutory feelings are considered to be paranoid. That is, they are not based on any real or immediate danger from the outside world. The children must keep the good breast and the bad breast separate, because to confuse them would be to risk annihilating the good breast and losing it as a safe harbor. In the young child's schizoid world, rage and destructive feelings are directed towards the bad breast, while feelings of love and comfort are associated with the good breast. So let's move on with the depressive position. Beginning at about 5 or 6 months, an infant begins to view external objects as whole and to see that good and bad can exist in the same person. Children in the depressive position recognize that the loved object and the hated object are now one and the same. They reproach themselves for their previous destructive urges towards their mother and desire to make reparation for these attacks. It is resolved when children fantasize that they have made reparation for their previous transgressions, and when they recognize that their mother will not go away permanently but will return after each departure. And also when the depressive position is resolved, children choose the split between the good and the bad, choose to close the split between the good and the bad mother, and is able not only to experience love from their mother but also to display their own love for her. So the next one is the psychic mechanism, which consists of interjection, projection, splitting, and the projective identification. So let's start with the interjection. By interjection, Klein simply meant that infants fantasize taking into their body those perceptions and experiences that they have had with the external object, originally the mother's breast. Interjection begins with an infant's first feeding, when there is an attempt to incorporate the mother's breast into the infant's body. Ordinarily, the infant tries to interject good objects to take them inside itself as a protection against anxiety. However, sometimes the infant interjects bad objects such as bad breast or the bad penis in order to gain control over them. Interjected objects are not accurate representation of the real objects but are colored by children's fantasies. For example, infant will fantasize that their mother is constantly present. That is, they feel that their mother is always inside their body. The real mother, of course, is not perpetually present, but infants nevertheless devour her in fantasy so that she becomes a constant internal object. So the next one is the projection. Just as infants just as infants use interjection to take in both good and bad objects, they use projection to get rid of them. Projection is the fantasy that one's own feelings and impulses actually reside in another person and not within one's body. Children project both bad and good images onto external objects, especially their parents. For example, a young boy who desires to castrate his father may instead project these castration fantasies onto his father, thus turning his castration wishes around and blaming his father for wanting to castrate him. Similarly, a young girl might fantasize devouring her mother but projects that fantasy onto her mother, who she fears will retaliate by persecuting her. The next one is the splitting. Infants can only manage the good and bad aspects of themselves and of external objects by splitting them, that is, by keeping apart incompatible impulses. In order to separate bad and good objects, the ego must itself be split. Those infants develop a picture of both the good me and the bad me that enables them to deal with both pleasurable and destructive impulses towards external objects. For instance, if children's egos are too rigid to be split into good me and bad me, then they cannot interject bad experiences into the good ego. When children cannot accept their own bad behavior, they must then deal with destructive and terrifying impulses in the only way they can, by repressing them. So the next one and the last one is the projective identification. The fourth means of reducing anxiety is projective identification, a psychic defense mechanism in which infants split off unacceptable parts of themselves, project them into another object, and finally interject them back into themselves in a changed or distorted form. For example, infants typically split off parts of their destructive impulse and project them into the bad, which is the frustrating breast. Next, they identify with the breast by interjecting it, a process that permits them to gain control over the dreaded and wonderful breast. So let's move on with the three important internalizations, which is the ego, the superego, and the Oedipus complex. Let's start first with the ego. Klein believed that the ego, or one's sense of self, reaches maturity at much earlier stage than Freud had assumed. Although Freud hypothesized that the ego exists at birth, he did not attribute complex psychic functions to it until about the third or fourth year. Klein believed that although the ego is mostly unorganized at birth, it nevertheless is strong enough to feel anxiety, to use defense mechanism, and to form early object relations in both fantasy and reality. The ego begins to evolve with the infant's first experience with feeding, when the good breast fills the infant not only with milk but with love and security. But the infant also experiences the bad breast, the ones that is not present or does not give milk, love, or security. For example, when the ego experiences the good breast, it expects similar good experiences with other objects such as its own fingers, a pacifier, or his father. Thus, the infant's first object relations, which is the breast, becomes prototype not only for the ego's future development, but for the individual's later interpersonal relations. So the next one is the superego. Klein's picture of the superego differs from Freud's in at least three important respects. First, it emerges much earlier in life. Second, it is not an outgrowth of the Oedipus complex. And third, it is much more harsh and cruel. Klein would concur that the more mature superego produces feelings of inferiority and guilt, but her analysis of young children led her to believe that this early superego produces not guilt but terror. Klein would describe a 5-year-old child's superego in much the same way Freud did. By the fifth or sixth year, the superego arouses little anxiety but a great measure of guilt. It has lost most of its severity while gradually being transformed into a realistic conscience. However, Klein rejected Freud's notion that the superego is a consequence of the Oedipus complex. Instead, she insisted that it grows along with the Oedipus complex and finally emerges as realistic guilt after the Oedipus complex is controlled. So the Oedipus next one is the Oedipus complex. Although Klein believed that her view of the Oedipus complex was merely an extension and not a refutation of Freud's ideas, her conception departed from the Freudian one in several ways. First, Klein held that the Oedipus complex begins at a much earlier age than Freud had suggested. Second, Klein believed that a significant part of the Oedipus complex is children's fear of retaliation from their parent for their fantasy of emptying the parent's body. Third, she stressed the importance of children retaining positive feelings toward both parents during the Oedipal years. Fourth, she hypothesized that during its early stages, the Oedipus complex serves the same need for both gender, that is, to establish a positive attitude with good or gratifying object, and to avoid the bad or terrifying object, which is the bad breast or the bad penis. In this position, children of either gender can direct their love either alternately or simultaneously towards each parent. Those children are capable of both homosexual and heterosexual relations with both parents. Like Freud, Klein assumed that girls and boys eventually come to experience the Oedipus complex differently. That is all. Thank you for listening.